We have finally made it to the Axon terminal, and I would like to take you through the events that occur at the Axon terminal, just summarize them for you. Please remember to follow along with your figures in the book because it's really the best way to get the details out of this summary. Okay, so we had an action potential that took place in the Axon, and I'm kind of ignoring that. I'm going to draw the Axon terminal, the end of the Axon here. Then there will be a space called the synapse, and then there will be the dendrites of the next neuron. So I need to give you some terminology just to make sure that we're all on the same page. This neuron here is called the presynaptic neuron. Pre coming before the synapse, meaning this one has just fired the action potential down to the end because it has voltage gated channels, and the action potential propagated and it reached the end of the axon. Now there's going to be a transition from the electrical signal to a chemical signal. And the chemicals we called ligands. They're also called neurotransmitters, neurocrines, neuromodulators. They have lots of different names. Ligand is the generic word that we now use in the 21st century. And there are vesicles here. So the events that take place involve getting the chemical, which is stored here, the ligand, out of these vesicles into the synapse here, because there will be a receptor on the postsynaptic neurons' dendrites. So this is a postsynaptic neuron, and these are the dendrites. Again, you need to look at the figures in your textbook that I listed for you on your to-do list. It will help you immensely. So the receptor is over here, and it might very well be a channel. So it can receive that ligand. It has a gate that will open, and then that will be a channel. For example, let's make this receptor channel a ligand-gated sodium channel. So when we get there, that's what you'll be seeing. Let's go over the steps. Okay, so step one, the action potential will reach the end of the axon, which is called the axon terminal, which is here, which is the very end. And I should title this lecture summary events at the axon terminal. Okay, that's more specific. So when the action potential reaches the axon terminal, there are new voltage gated channels here. Please don't think that these new voltage gated channels, which are at the axon terminal, which are for calcium, that they're part of the action potential. That's a common pitfall that students fall into. They think that these voltage gated channels are part of the action potential. No, the action potential in a neuron looks like a spike. It is only due to sodium and potassium voltage gated channels. Okay, but when you get this action potential reaching the axon terminal, that electrical influence is bringing the voltage gated calcium channels to their threshold. So indeed, step two will be opening of the voltage gated calcium channels. And at the end of the semester, we'll have a big, huge, long list of all the things that calcium does in the human body. That'll be our summary of human physiology, one of the ways that we summarize it. And the first thing on the list will probably be exocytosis. You're going to see it right here. When the voltage gated calcium channels open, you need to memorize calcium is high outside the axon terminal and it's low inside. So if you haven't learned that ion, in addition to the high and low gradients for sodium and potassium and chloride ions, you need to. So when these channels open, calcium flows from high to low, and that calcium entering the axon terminal will trigger exocytosis. So I'm going to put that as step 3, which is actually occurring inside the axon terminal, exocytosis. And if you don't remember exocytosis from anatomy, you can look it up. It's in chapter 5. Exo means exiting. Cyto means cell. Tosis, process. So this is a process of something exiting the cell. So these vesicles can then fuse, because they're made out of phospholipids, with the cell membrane of the presynaptic neuron. And the contents will actually exit the cell. And now they're over here in the synapse, and they can bind with their receptor on the postsynaptic neuron. And that is indeed what happens. So if we were to carry this further, we would say step 4 would be ligand is going to be released into the synapse. And that's the synapse, is the space between the presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron. When the ligand binds to its receptor, the receptor might be a channel. And that's bringing us full circle to where we talked about graded potentials. Okay, so let's just pretend, for example, that this is a receptor channel that is a sodium channel. There's a lot of language, lots of terminology today. If this ligand, for example, is acetylcholine, we can abbreviate that ACH. That's an abbreviation I often use for acetylcholine. And the name of the channel that binds to this ligand is a cholinergic receptor. That is a mouthful. You need to practice getting familiar with it, because we're going to be seeing it a lot in the autonomic nervous system. But this would be a cholinergic, because the root word is acetylcholine. That's the same root word there. Cholinergic receptor. And it is a receptor channel. It is receiving the ligand, acetylcholine, which is red there. But the channel part of that word is for the ion that flows through that channel. It has to be the specific size, specific charge. And I told you that this is a sodium, a ligand-gated sodium channel. So the sodium will come in. It's going from where sodium is high to where sodium is low. Channels can only do facilitated diffusion. And so this is going to cause the inside to become more positive. More positive. So in the end, what we're going to see on the postsynaptic neuron is we're going to see a depolarization, or a depolarizing graded potential. When that trickles down and has positive influence on this neuron's axon hillock, we would call that an excitatory influence. So I need to tell you there's several different ways that your book, chapter 8, looks at this event. It calls it a depolarization. It calls it a depolarizing graded potential, because a little bit of acetylcholine will cause a little bit of sodium to flow. A lot of acetylcholine will open the gates for longer, cause a lot of sodium to flow. So you get a little bit or a lot of positive influence entering the postsynaptic neuron. It can also be called an excitatory postsynaptic potential. So I'll write that down for you. Causes an EPSP. That is excitatory postsynaptic potential. Okay, I think this is going to be hard to grasp all that language without reading the textbook. So again, I've given you the figures that go along with this lecture summary, and I would access those if you need help. Excitatory postsynaptic potential is the same thing as a graded potential, is the same thing as a depolarization at the dendrites. Okay, so lots of language. If you look at my practice quizzes, which are posted online, there's one of them for Chapter 8, material on the neuron. If you look at that, you'll be able to see that I call them the same thing. I expect you to know that on the quiz. Okay, if we were to have another presynaptic neuron over here that releases a different chemical, and please remember the number of neurons which can influence a postsynaptic neuron, the number of places on those dendrites is 10,000. 10,000 is an average number of presynaptic neurons. So if we had another chemical ligand, I'm running out of colors here, and that would be an example of an IPSP. So this example would cause hyperpolarization. The inside would become more negative on the postsynaptic neuron, and this causes an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. Okay? Inhibitory postsynaptic potential. Okay, again, that's the EPSP and the IPSP, which are greater potentials in the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, I need to back up a second and just chat with you briefly about what happens to this chemical ligand, which in our example we called acetylcholine. What happens to it when it's in the synapse? There are three things, which again, there's a figure that you can access in your textbook, which I call in my notes here the fate of the ligand. And you can find that figure, and you can see it in the textbook. It's great. There's three things that could happen to this ligand. The result has already occurred. We got the ligand to bind to the receptor. It did its thing, which was open the gate, and now it's done. We need to get the ligand out of this space because we want this to be a fine-tuned process. Every time an action potential travels down here, we want it to be a fine-tuned process of releasing a specific amount of ligand. The ligand does its job, and then it gets out of there. We don't want the ligand to hang out in the synapse forever. That would be a problem. Okay? So the fate of the ligand is to actually go away. So the question I'm asking you, I want you to understand, where can it go? How does it get out of this space when its job is done? And there are three things that you can look at in the figure in your textbook that I'm going to write for you here that you need to know, which I will call the fate of the ligand. Number one thing that can happen is it can go back into the presynaptic neuron. So there would be a transporter here, and it would transport the ligand back into the presynaptic neuron so that after it's floated around here for a while, it can go back up where it came from, and it's like recycling. It's called reuptake. Reuptake. That's the first thing that could happen to get it out of the synapse when it's done its job. The second thing that can happen to it is there could be enzymes, and there are enzymes that live here on the postsynaptic neuron. And sorry, I meant to look like that's attached there. Okay, it's attached there to the postsynaptic neuron, and they can basically gobble up or destroy these ligands that are floating over there. Okay, and that is an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, if it's acetylcholine. If it's epi, norepi, dopamine, serotonin, it would be called MAOIs. And so that is your enzyme which will destroy the ligand. And finally, the last one, number three, fate, is pretty easy. They just diffuse away out of this space. So that's number three. I'm just going to say diffusion. And please make sure you look at that in your textbook because this is a big, huge mess. Maybe you've heard of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That's the modern day antidepressant, SSRIs. And they would block or inhibit the reuptake of serotonin. So if this chemical is not acetylcholine, but it's serotonin, and you block the reuptake, then the body thinks that you're making more serotonin, but you're actually not. You're just letting it stay in that space, do its job of binding to the receptors longer. And there's some book problems about that. I recommend you look at them. Okay, finally, at the end of this unit, figure 8.23, I love that. You should look at it. I want you to get this idea in your head that you could have a postsynaptic neuron here, somewhere in the body, a different postsynaptic neuron here, which can bind to the same chemical. So if we had a presynaptic neuron here and another place in the body, both of these could release acetylcholine. Okay, I like to try to give you real life examples because when we get to this in chapter autonomic nervous system unit, chapter 11, it'll make more sense. Okay? So here is the acetylcholine, which is going to be coming out here into this space, and I'll abbreviate that. And so we would put the very same receptor here, which would be a channel for sodium. So it's binding to the acetylcholine, and when the gate opens, the cargo that flows through the channel is going to be sodium. And sodium comes in, and the end result is EPSP. Okay, you saw that on the previous slide. I want to give you another example of something that you might see in the human body, and that would be a receptor over here on these dendrites, but it is not a channel. Okay, so I usually color it in like that, meaning there's no pore there for ions to flow through. So when the acetylcholine binds here, it's going to be activating this receptor, but this is not a receptor channel. Over here, this receptor is a receptor that is also a channel, for example, for sodium. But this receptor is just a receptor. It is not a channel. So we don't call it just a receptor. We call it a metabotropic receptor. So this is an example of a metabotropic receptor. And that's just a fancy word, metabotropic, meaning it's going to involve a series of steps to get the ions to flow across the dendrites of this postsynaptic neuron. So it's a series of steps, metabotropic, whereas in this receptor channel, it's only basically one step. So you would get ligand binding, and it's one package. Open the gate, ion flows. The receptor is the channel. But for metabotropic receptor over here, the receptor is not the channel. The receptor is just a receptor, or a metabotropic receptor. And over here, you would have a channel. I'm going to discuss this in more detail later, but basically from the inside, the receptor, when it gets activated, will send a message over here to this channel, and it will say, open. And for example, let's pretend that this is a potassium channel, because you actually really do have metabotropic receptors in the human body that will bind acetylcholine that work in this way to open potassium channels. So these are real life examples of channels that you're going to see next week, coming up so soon for cholinergic receptors. Okay? They bind acetylcholine and they can work in different ways. Let's see what's happening here. So metabotropic receptor binds to the acetylcholine, and it sends a messenger through the inside of the cell, opens the potassium channel. Now our ions flow. Potassium flows high to low. Yes, high to low. That will always be high to low through a channel. Potassium leaves the cell. That's a positive charge leaving the cell. So this presynaptic cell is getting a message to become more negative inside. That is IPSP. Wow, so one chemical, acetylcholine, can cause two different responses in postsynaptic neurons. It can cause EPSP, it can cause IPSP. Okay, and that's really important because it's not the chemical that you could memorize. Oh, acetylcholine always does this. It's the receptor. What is the receptor doing? It's the receptor that makes the difference in the postsynaptic neuron. Is the receptor causing sodium ions to flow? That's EPSP. is the receptor causing potassium ions to flow. That is IPSP. So you really need to focus your attention on the receptor, because this receptor is what causes the response. In the postsynaptic neuron. It is not the chemical. It is the receptor. Okay, finally the last thing that you'll see in this unit is sometimes there's strange things that happen out here where you have a leaky channel. Remember leaky channels from long, long ago? We're coming full circle as we conclude our unit on neurons. What is significant about resting membrane potential? If you need to go back and review the resting membrane potential, you will be reminded of leaky channels in the sodium-potassium pump, which is everywhere throughout the neuron, to establish a resting membrane potential. But leaky channels can also close. That would not be a common thing, but it could happen. Like, that's why I said 99.9% of the time, leaky channels are open. But if we were to come along and we were to close a leaky channel, and that leaky channel is located here in the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron, it would cause a change in charge across the membrane. For example, remember I said all neurons in the human body are super duper leaky to potassium, and potassium is always leaking out, and that's a positive that's always leaking 99% of the time, and that makes the inside negative compared to the outside, so the resting membrane potential is negative. Well, if we had a situation where, sorry, that means my time is up. I need to say goodbye. But if we had a situation where the leaky channel was closed, and metabotropic receptors can do this, then what can you imagine would happen for that brief moment where potassium is not leaking out as much as it was? It would cause the inside to become more positive, and that would be an EPSP. Okay, so as we're concluding this, and you look at that figure that has all the EPSPs, IPSPs, it's the grand conclusion, chapter 8, I think it's 8.23. You're going to see all of these examples. Let me know if you have questions, please. That's my job, to answer your questions. Okay, talk to you soon.